As one of Overwatch's original cast members, Zarya spawned from a simple idea. What if you benefited directly from protecting your teammates? Obviously, keeping your teammates alive is usually beneficial, sometimes a feed, but usually keeping your teammates alive is a good idea. But Zarya's bubbles, in particular, take it one step further, completely protecting your teammate for as long as the bubble lasts, cleansing the teammate protected by it, and giving Zarya charge based on the amount of damage the bubble takes. Creates a consistent risk versus reward situation. Breaking bubbles fast enough could net your team the elimination, but is it worth giving the Zarya the charge? Or do you even have enough damage to get the target after the bubble is gone? Or would it just be better to ignore the bubble target for the duration and potentially let them free fire on you for a while? A high charge Zarya is often a lethal, while a low charge Zarya is frequently useless, and yet despite this feast or famine nature, she's always been a tank that relies on synergies with other heroes to thrive. Her lack of mobility and surprising squishiness alongside a great combo ult in Graph further plays into her synergistic nature, needing teammates to cover her weaknesses and emphasize her strengths. So, let's take a look at who she's been played alongside historically and cover Zarya's competitive history from release to the present day. The beginning of Overwatch didn't have a meta, as the game was new and there was no competitive play. The start of competitive play alongside Ana's release led to the first actual metas in Overwatch's history. The first real meta in Overwatch's history was the Beyblade meta, which was just about buffing Reaper to high heaven with nano boost, Lucio speed, and bubbles in order to prevent any stuns from coming through. Because Nano Boost at the time also provided a speed boost and that could stack with Lucio speed, a Reaper ulting with Nano Boost and a Lucio amped speed could basically just run forward and wipe the entire team, and Bubbles just made that even safer. However, once Nano Boost lost the speed boost it provided, Triple Tank took over, with Ana's Biotic Grenade doubling the healing provided, and 3 tank health bars would provide Ana with her Nano Boost very frequently, which could then be popped on like a Genji for a Nano Blade combo. Even when Triple Tank wasn't played though, Zarya was the most common tank paired with the other tanks until D.Va started to rise in popularity, which leads us to 2017, the year of the original dive composition. Zarya saw very little play, as Winston and D.Va dominated the tank lineup throughout all of 2017, whether that be the original dive, or later on in 2017 with the Moth meta. Winston and D.Va were just able to keep up with the pace of the game, and didn't die immediately to Discord Orb plus high poke damage. The one bit of good news for Zarya though, is that in July, they buffed Graviton Surge, and made it prevent all movement abilities to be used while inside of it. And going from 2017 to 2018 though, D.Va's dominance held strong, and Zarya was the least played tank throughout all of 2018, even though D.Va received many nerfs going into and throughout 2018. Zarya was the least played tank throughout Stage 1 of Overwatch League's inaugural season, and she was the second least played tank throughout the entirety of Stage 2. The triple tank composition of Reinhardt, D.Va, and Zarya did see a lot more play on maps that favored Brawl alongside Moira and Lucio for the AoE support. When I say maps that favor Brawl, I mean maps that have very constricting choke points, so think of like King's Row or Lijiang Tower's inside map. For Lijiang Control Center especially, Zarya would see play on this map throughout almost the entire year, with one exception being the Stage 3, as Orisa and Hogs saw continued buffs while Zarya saw no changes, and Zarya saw literally no play during the Stage 3 playoffs. Stage 4 of the inaugural season of the Overwatch League saw the original GOATS composition start to take off in popularity, but it was still pretty niche and usually only played on Brawl maps. Despite Rikita's introduction leading to a decrease in dive being played, all it meant for tanks is that instead of playing Winston D.Va all the time, now you'd play Winston D.Va, Orisa D.Va, or Orisa Roadhogs. The inaugural season's playoffs were held in June, where the playoff meta was a double sniper meta, but on a map like King's Row and other Brawl maps, GOATS did rear its head, and it was played the most on those types of maps. Even in Ranked, where Zarya can be comboed with other characters, she's still most commonly paired with Reinhardt, and given that dive was just better, she didn't see that much success until the rise of Grab Dragon in June of 2018, which really only existed because Hanzo's Dragon Strike was bugged apparently, and Mercy could damage boost it. Even after Dragon Strike was bug fixed and Mercy could no longer damage boost that, Grab was just too strong, and so it had its radius decreased from 8 meters to 6 meters, but in return Zarya had her energy degeneration decreased to compensate. Following the nerfs to both snipers in August of 2018, the GOATS composition would proceed to dominate the meta for the next full year, as 2019 was dominated by GOATS until it was literally forced out of the game. The original GOATS composition was comprised of a Reinhardt, who was able to prevent most of the damage while walking up with his shield and was devastating in close ranges, and Earthshatter was a very good ultimate at the time, especially considering there was overall less mobility in the game. A D.Va, in order to eat up projectiles at range and eat up spam and prevent things like Pharah Mercy or Bastion from getting that much value. A Zarya, in order to have even a higher damage output and to prevent a lot of stuns from going through, as Bubble was one of the only things that would prevent something like a Brig Bash, as Brig was also required in this comp in order to stamp out and dive, and also just because she was just flat out broken. Brig was broken. Rally provided armor, her repair pack was instant health and provided over armor, she had a bash that went through shields and stuns, she did too much damage, she out-healed you, she was broken. Brig's only weakness is that she struggled against long-range characters as she needed to be up close in order to actually heal her teammates consistently. That's where Moira would come in, as her potent AoE healing would provide high heals for the entire team, and she would build up full really quickly. And Lucio was used to round out the composition, as Sound Barrier has consistently been one of the strongest ultimates, and an AoE speed boost for 3 tanks and 2 supports, 2 characters of which are melee. Yeah, that's pretty important too. As more teams decided to pick up the Goat's Mirror though, teams swapped out the Moira for an Ana initially, as Ana's anti-nade would prevent all healing from going through, it would allow teams to bowl over with the Bio-nade landing, but as Zarya's, Reinhardt's, and D.Va's especially got better at eating up nades, Ana was swapped out for Zenyatta, as Trance provided another defensive ultimate, and Discorder would allow you to rip through whoever is discorded at the time. Zarya was the main damage dealer in the GOAT's composition, as she consistently had high charge if played well, and Grab was one of the most important ultimates to build, given that it was the main fight winner most of the time. However, as professional play in 2019 continued on, Sombra infiltrated the comp, as this GOAT's composition was incredibly reliant on its abilities in order to get things done, and Sombra's hack could just negate that, and EMP was a fight winner, especially considering it would completely destroy Lucio's Sound Barrier overhealth, meaning that only Trance and Rally could do anything into Sombra's EMP. In a GOAT's Mirror, D.Va was the most important target to be hacked, and she would find herself consistently hacked, given that negating Defense Matrix meant that Poke would actually stick onto the Reinhardt shield, and thus D.Va would see less play, and Sombra would see more, which also meant that Ana would find herself seeing play once again, given that she was mostly pushed out over Zenyatta because of Defense Matrix eating up her nades. Despite how strong GOATS as a composition was, there were teams that refused to play it, and when they played their counter GOATS compositions, they wouldn't really run Zarya, so Zarya was really only meta because GOATS was meta at the time. Now, obviously, GOATS wouldn't have been as effective if Zarya wasn't also strong inside of the composition, but Zarya didn't see any play in the counter GOATS compositions. This also meant that with the implementation of 222 Urlock, Zarya was removed from the meta. Following the initial release of the 222 Urlock, Double Shield held its grasp on the meta until January of 2020 when Orisa and Sigma's nerfs finally caught up to them. For the Overwatch League specifically, because there were hero bans every week, the meta shook up pretty frequently, but while 2020 started out with Rein D.Va being the main tank duo, Double Shield with Rein plus Orisa, Rein plus Sigma, and Orisa Sigma were still somewhat viable, and by the time the Mei Melee came around, Double Shield was the preferred comp with Orisa Sigma as the tank duo once again. Following the Mei Melee, the Summer Showdown happened, and while Double Shield was still the main composition played, there was still quite a bit of flexibility overall, and following the Summer Showdown, Zarya finally got to step back up into the limelight with the rise of the Double Bubble composition. Double Bubble is a moniker for the Winston plus Zarya tank duo, and the reason why this works is because Zarya's bubbles enable him even better than Defense Matrix, because Winston's main weakness is to boops and stuns from characters like Lucio, Brig, and Cassidy. While Winston was bubbled by Zarya, he would be completely protected from these types of crowd control, and Zarya would benefit from the enemy focusing the Winston jumping into their team. Additionally, while Zarya struggles with positioning, especially on high grounds, Winston can pressure these positions that Zarya would normally struggle to do. So, your team either has the option to ignore the Winston that's jumping into your team, cleaving your entire team for free damage, and focusing the rest of the Double Bubbles team, or you can try to shoot the Winston, but first you have to go through the Zarya bubble, followed by the Winston bubble, and by then he'll probably have his cooldowns back. It is worth noting that at this time, D.Va was Zarya's main competition, given that D.Va had received some buffs making her better into the snipers that were starting to rise in dominance at this time, because as 2020 got to August, there was an extreme meta shakeup with Orisa, Sigma, and Brig all receiving nerfs, while Roadhog got one of the most devastating buffs to ever see the game, as Ranked became inundated with the double off-tank of Hog plus Sigma or Hog plus Zarya, and even in pro play, they weren't immune from this double off-tank, with Sigma plus Roadhog being the most common duo as time went on, but it all started with Washington Justice's Roadhog plus Zarya combo. The main reason Zarya fell out of the pro meta at this time is because she was just too squishy and lacked the range that Sigma had or the durability that Wrecking Ball had into these double sniper comps. Additionally, they nerfed her alt-fire ammo cost in late August, reverting a buff that she'd gotten slightly earlier. Following nerfs to Roadhog, Double Bubble and Zarya herself were still fairly common going into 2021, despite the fact that Zarya received even more nerfs, this time increasing her drain rate. However, in June of 2021, Zarya would see her minimum damage reduced from 95 to 75, and while this only temporarily removed her from the meta, once she came back in these Brawl compositions, she wasn't at the same level of dominance that she was before, as she was just one of the many tanks available, and D.Va would remain the primary off-tank of choice for the rest of 6v6 Overwatch. Going into 2022 and the beta of Overwatch 2, 5v5 had Zarya start out as one of the stronger tanks, as grab was really difficult to deal with and her barriers were buffed heavily, knowing that she would be one of the weaker tanks to start. However, she wasn't strong enough to out-brawl all of the other Brawl tanks, namely Reinhardt, and she ended up falling off during the mid-season as Zenyatta's buffs pushed Sigma to becoming the most played tank. As players improved, Winston ended up overtaking Sigma, as Winston was just harder to punish for the Summer Tracer DPS line than Sigma, and Winston was still able to dive the Ana-Zenyatta duo. Moving from mid-season madness to the Summer Showdown, this was dominated by Jotes, so Zarya didn't see any play as Junker Queen was by far the strongest tank at the time. Following Junker Queen's nerfs during the Countdown Cup, Zarya dominated, and she dominated Ranked after Overwatch 2's full release. Professional meta was slightly different as Winston saw play over Zarya after Kiriko's release, and the Winston Reaper Sojourn comp was able to shred through Zarya's bubbles fast enough in professional play, but in Ranked, that just wasn't as possible. Due to her overperformance during the first season, specifically November of 2022, Zarya saw a nerf to both her bubble cooldown and its duration. January of 2023 started with her receiving a buff to her energy degeneration rate, followed by receiving a nerf to Grab's charge rate, followed by receiving a buff to her bubbles cooldowns, but nothing actually brought her into the meta. Zarya has historically struggled into high mobility and has only been able to counter that when she has teammates in order to patch up that weakness. Given that Dive was the strongest composition at the time, she really couldn't do much, and Ramatra was the strongest Brawl tank, and she really can't do anything into Ramatra. In September of 2023, she received buffs that brought her power level significantly up, but because Bastion was meta, Zarya just got shredded too fast to be played. The allied bubble was too strong though, so it had all of the buffs reverted except for the cooldown reduction. So even though Zarya was definitely strong in Ranked at the time, she wasn't strong enough in coordinated play to actually accomplish much of anything. Following Mauga's release and going into 2024, Mauga just meant no other tank could be played, and after his nerfs, Orisa took the reins as the strongest tank once again. The Season 9 changes in February of 2024 meant that all tanks just died really fast, but Zarya did receive buffs about a week later, raising her primary fire from 85 to 170 to 95 to 190. In May of 2024, she saw another round of buffs, this time to Grav, increasing its radius and its duration. Throughout most of this time, Zarya was considered to be a strong tank if you could rule your lobbies, but she wasn't consistent enough at higher ranks. The main reason for this is the best way to play tank at higher tiers of play is by controlling space, not necessarily by getting kills, and being able to survive for a while is greatly important, especially when burst damage is high. Zarya was buffed alongside all the other tanks in July of 2024, but she was nerfed 3 days later because her bubbles were just too strong at protecting herself and teammates, and she just got too much charge from them. She did receive another buff in August of 2024, raising its damage from 47 to 95 to 55 to 110. Following Juno's release, the Juno Brig meta meant that Zarya was really easy to bowl over with Mauga, but Zarya did see play into the Junker Queen counter comp that was used by the NRG Shock into the main Mauga composition. Given that the Juno Brig backline was too strong to pass up, Kiriko couldn't really be picked that consistently, but There was one other character that can cleanse anti-heal and Jungle Queen's wounds, which is Zarya, hence why she saw play into the Jungle Queen comp. While Hazard dominated the tank spot going into 2025 and following the introduction of perks, Zarya did find some play in specific compositions. In March of 2025, she ended up having her energy degeneration rate increased because perks enabled her to access high ground a lot easier. Keep in mind, Zarya has historically not been good at contesting high ground because she lacks any form of mobility. Now she actually has a way to contest high grounds. While 2025 was dominated by the block slot tanks, Zarya was still really strong, and this was most notable as soon as hero bans were introduced, as Zarya really started to see a lot more ire thrown her way. While Zarya's pressure output is really high, and she has one of the highest DPS levels out of any character in the game, it's not high enough to get past characters like Hazard, Orisa, and Ramatra blocking, which means that in professional play, Zarya can die a lot faster than these other tanks do. This is especially emphasized when the strongest characters at the time are Symmetra and Hitscans, who can poke Zarya out, or can run her over using the teleporter. However, these blocking characters saw nerfs, and Zarya received Energy Converter, which broke the camel's back. Because of the fact that Zarya was the strongest tank at the time, Ramatra was specifically played in pro play because of his good matchup into a character like Zarya, being able to absorb her pressure alongside the rest of her team's pressure. However, following Vendetta's release, Zarya went from ranked lobby stopper to professionally played almost all the time. Once again, a character that dives into the middle of the team and is really strong at doing so, Zarya being able to bubble them basically stops all counterplay to that character, while also empowering the Zarya, who's already one of the stronger tanks. Going into 2026 and the release of Season 1, Zarya saw her maximum damage reduced from 190 to 175, which has effectively removed her from her spot of number 1 tank in the game, and the removal of Energy Converter has made her a lot less consistently high charged, and thus, while she is still in the meta and she's played fairly frequently, and she's still one of the most banned characters in Ranked, she isn't as dominant as she was even a month ago. So now that we know when exactly Zarya has been meta, what exactly makes her meta? Well, looking at the most recent time she popped into the meta, Energy Converter being the thing that broke the camel's back, just shows that when the risk-reward of her kits used too strongly in the reward direction, she gets really strong really fast. The only other time she's consistent meta is when her numbers are just too high, like in early Overwatch 2 and immediately after perks were introduced. However, Zarya is most commonly meta as a result of having synergistic partners that cover her weaknesses and amplify her strengths. Characters that like to play aggressively can help feed her charge while she enables them to play aggressively like literally no other character can. Vendetta is merely the most recent example, as Doom, Reaper, Winston, and Reinhardt are all famous and common examples that have worked with her in the past, and there are many other heroes that work with her just as well. It's also very common that these aggressive characters will cover her weaknesses, the main one being that she lacks range, while Vendetta, Doom, Reaper, Genji, Winston, they all have ways to gap close and can deal with this ranged pressure well. Their main weakness, in turn, is struggling with CC, and they're prone on getting burst on their way in, and bubbles let them engage way more freely, and they can get much more consistent value in teamfights. Additionally, the ability to double bubble a single target, either Zarya herself or a teammate, makes bubbles a lot harder to balance, as bubbles being up constantly for any target keeps them invulnerable, and temporarily invulnerable heroes piloted at the pro level are insanely difficult to deal with. This double bubble issue is only a thing in 5v5 as Zarya has only had the Tide bubble charge because of solo tanking, which has also led to her becoming one of the most hated and banned tanks in the game. But does she actually need this Tide bubble charge in order to tank properly in 5v5? Obviously, the main reason why she's needed it is because being a solo tank with a single defensive ability for yourself that lacks versatility is really difficult to make work. Without the Tide bubble cooldown, Zarya lacks armor, sustainability, and mobility to really function well in a 5v5 environment. However, this Tide bubble cooldown makes her really frustrating to play into because tracking bubbles is more difficult because there are different cooldowns for herself versus for teammates. She will also frequently have a bubble charge to keep an already difficult to pin down character alive even longer, and it reduces skill as you don't need to manage yourself and team bubble, it's just the bubble charge you need to manage. Obviously, Zarya isn't the easiest tank to play, but She does have a lot lower of a skill floor when you just have 2 bubbles and you're constantly using them on yourself because you don't rely on your teammates as much as you should. Without going too far into 5v5 versus 6v6, Zarya in 6v6 with another tank has to rely on both herself and her teammates, whereas in 5v5 you can just act as a raid boss. In becoming a functional, if not strong, solo tank, you've lost a lot of what makes Zarya unique in the first place. But what buffs would Zarya even need in order to make the non-tide bubble charge work in a 5v5 solo tank environment? Should the Feast or Famine tank be consistent in their defensive capability? Or should they lean into the theme of the risk versus reward and be rewarded even more for proper bubble usage? Leaning into the Feast or Famine nature, they can increase her damage across charge levels and or reduce the energy degeneration rate, or if they want to go the more defensive route, they can increase the health and or duration of the bubbles, or decrease the cooldown of the bubbles. However, I would be a little wary of going too far down this defensive route, as the main issue with Zarya currently is seemingly always having a bubble ready for whenever a teammate needs it. Thus, if you decrease the cooldown, that really doesn't fix this core frustration, and while increasing the health and or duration of the bubbles enhances their effectiveness while keeping the weakness of the downtime alive, if the health and duration is increased by too much, then it really just makes one character super strong for too long. Another thing they can do is they can base kit jump ups, which would make her a lot better at taking control of high grounds, while still keeping her core weakness of a lack of mobility in mind. The main goal of any changes to Zarya that are directly aimed at her game health should make her less frustrating to play against by increasing the downtime of her bubbles while keeping her fun to play as, by increasing her energy and playing into her synergistic play patterns. After all, Zarya is at her most interesting when she succeeds from playing with a symbiotic teammate, whether that be a second tank or an aggressive DPS partner. From the current Zarya Vendetta to the Rein Zarya of old, Zarya is about enabling aggressive play of her team and benefiting off of it, and needing to make decisions about who to bubble and cycling her cooldowns to feast on her high charge, or remain starving for that charge and failing to accomplish much. I hope that you all enjoyed learning about Zarya's competitive history, as well as the snuck-in game design aspects, and if you did, if you wouldn't mind subscribing to the channel, that would help me out greatly, and I'd appreciate it. Obviously, if you have any ideas for the changes you would make to Zarya in order to improve her game health, leave them in the comments below. Just make sure to keep it respectful, as I hope that I was able to convey my respect for the character despite disliking her current iteration, because I do think Zarya has a really cool concept. I just also think that there are improvements to her kit that could be made in order to lessen frustration and enhancing this Feast or Famine playstyle. Once again, I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one.